Hey guys, welcome out to Revolution this morning. We're going to continue with our series on the Johannium, and specifically we're going to be looking at, this is the third part of Erasmus's Annotationis, where he speaks about the comma. And so in his first and second edition, he doesn't really have much to say about the comma. He has just a few lines, but by his third edition, his fourth and fifth, there are pages written on this. And so we want to go through some of this information. Now, last time we were talking about Augustine, and then we started talking about Jerome. Now, some of this older literature can be hard to digest. It can be hard to even read. Now, I'll just grab where I am. Actually, it's none of that. I'll throw that over here. I'll close down my Facebook so I've got more freedom. Okay, so we're at this page, which is Grantley MacDonald's book, The Raising the Ghost of Arius. And so obviously Grantley MacDonald is not a fan of the comma. So he's written this dissertation, and also he's written a book against the Johannium. Now, but we're going through this anyway because he does translate from the Latin into English, and he's actually very good at Latin translation. And so we're going to go and just continue on through this. And as I said, some of it can be quite difficult because back in those days, people like Erasmus and More and Aldous, these people knew the early church writers like we would know the Beatles, like that they had been raised up in religious institutions that looked at someone like Augustine. Now, I know there are people out there who know quite a lot about Augustine, but for me personally, I've got a few books of Augustine on my shelf, The City of God and others. I've never really found it that interesting. Some of these church writers or church fathers, they get called, some of them I go to read the material and it doesn't really interest me that much. It doesn't stir my spirit. It's like, this is a bit weird or whatever. But sometimes it can be the way things are translated in certain books. They can be very dry, where really it should be better. But so when we're going through, especially someone like Erasmus, who's a humanist, he's looking into old Latin documents, old Greek documents. He will 1 minute talk about a church writer that you've hardly ever heard of, and then relate it to some other major author who's talking about Greek gods, and so he's at a level of intellect which even in his day would have been hard to grasp for the average layman. But today, looking back, 500 years later, we can be at a bit of a loss as to what he's actually saying. So I want to go through this nice and slowly. And one of the reasons that I'm doing this also, and I'm going to be doing a few weeks of Johannium material, is because I'm doing a debate in 10 days. So that's going to be on Valentine's Day here in Australia, but I guess it is not Valentine's Day in America. I think it's the 13th or something in America, or it's the 14th here. And so we're ahead of everyone. I remember a friend of mine was on a plane. He was sitting next to an American, and he said, "No, we're ahead of you guys." And he didn't like it. he got a bit shirty about it. Said, "No, you're not." And he said, "Yeah, we are. We're actually like nearly a day ahead." Sometimes Aussies like to stir up people, But so yeah, it's gonna be interesting. The guy who I'm debating is as far as I can tell, is a modalist. I haven't really looked into much of his material. So that will be my task for the next 10 days, is going through all that. Now, I've spent a lot of time going through TurretinFan's material, He's going through all the bullet points in the debate that we recently had. So we had 10 points. So I've gone through some of them. I've just sort of almost brushed off, like, look, I've answered that, you know. But other things he's been going through, like unicorn. He's been quite staunch that is an error. I don't know how much more information I can show to prove my point. It's to me, it's obvious. He keeps pointing out every time I say the word obvious, and you know, every person has their little quirks and and ah and say things wrong, and I say obvious quite a lot. Obviously, obvious. It's quite obvious, and so, but so he went through some of my Easter articles, and I was really glad that he did. And so this is one thing I'll take my hat off to TurretinFan. He is actually reading through my stuff, where other people, like I've found even, other people who I've debated haven't really bothered. They're just like, oh yeah, I'll just say what I want to say, and that's it, and pull out. Where TurretinFan's like, okay, well, we've had the debate. Let's look at what he's saying. And so after 20 years of compiling a lot of Easter information, he's going through this, and I'm like, well, okay. So he when he's reading through it, I think he can see where I'm coming from and why I would gravitate towards what I'm saying. And it's like, to me, initially, the whole Easter thing wasn't a King James issue at all. It was in a sense where I was like, okay, they're saying it's an error and it's a pagan thing. And that was the main thing that I was trying to debunk. And then I was like, okay, it's not a pagan thing, but is it an error? And then I went through it and I was like, actually, it's not an error. It's actually a good translation. And at the time, I was a New King James guy. And so I showed James White my findings. And he's like, oh, you're a Ruckmanite. And I'm like, oh, well, okay. But, and so in my first article in 2005, I specifically stated I am not a Ruckmanite. But now Mark Ward's, defined what a Ruckmanite is. And that's me, apparently. So I'm a Ruckmanite, according to these guys. And I just find these guys are absolutely obsessed with pigeonholing, naming you, saying, oh, you're a Nazi, or you're a fascist, or you're a communist, or you're you're part of the bourgeoisie, or you're this and you're that. And you're like, man, just leave me alone. Why do you have to continually label me? It's like when you're a libertarian, you come against, you say, look, Donald Trump's just the same as everyone else. They're like, what? You're a liberal? What? You're a Democrat? And it's like, no, I don't like them either. And then you go over to their camp and you're like, well, Hillary Clinton's should be in jail. And they're like, what? You support Trump? And you're like, I don't have to support either side. It's just the narrative, the two-party narrative. And it's really hard to talk to people who are in that. And someone like Mark Ward is creating a narrative, like the 10 points of Ruckmanism. And if you believe the King James is accurate in every place, you're a Ruckmanite. It's like, give me a break. Just stop slandering, stop lying. It just gets really tiring. But anyway, I'm going to focus on the Comma Johanneum. And so it's been quite a while since I did a video. When was that? That was October, November, December, January. So looking at nearly 4 months. So it is hard to remember exactly what has been done. So I'm just going to continue reading through this. Now, one thing that I was a little bit hesitant to read last time was this section here, where it has, because I know that Grantley MacDonald, even though he is a good translator from Latin into English, sometimes there is a bias there. Like, I've shown this in a few other videos, but we have right at the last page, he has the codices, agrees with our Latin codices so well that it might seem to be a lesbian straight edge. It's like, well, who's going to understand what that means, and why? Just because there is a word that that could have some sort of etymological link to the word lesbian doesn't mean that that's what it means, So that's where I sort of feel some of these words I've got to go through and check them out myself, because here we have And so, as I mentioned in my last video on this in October, 1522, so that's saying that the 1522 edition is saying this. Now, if we go down, we might see where it has, there's nothing yet, but it might say 1535 or 1527 in brackets. And so anyway, it doesn't. So pretty much the rest of this, it appeared in the 1522 and in all subsequent editions. So Erasmus, just if you've just tuned in and you don't have time to watch the other videos, Erasmus has 5 editions. Okay, his 1516, his 1519 didn't contain the comma, and in his annotations at the back of his Latin and Greek Bible, he has he had very, very minor footnotes, very minor annotationes, which are just explanations about why certain words are in there, or just to let people know his thoughts on certain verses. Sometimes it's text criticism, sometimes it's just to clarify things. But then after 1522, we see the last 3 editions, so 1522, 1527, and 1535. Now, Erasmus started 1536. So these last 3 have like pages and pages and pages written about the comma, because he included it in his last 3 editions. Now, people say, oh, he included it because the Catholics were going to kill him, or he promised that he would put it in if someone just found a manuscript with it in there. And so all of a sudden there's this manuscript in front of him and they're saying, oh, see, it was made to order and all this sort of stuff. But there's so many fake stories going around about Erasmus. That's why I really wanted to get into Erasmus's own literature. And so that's why I want to be careful that these words are accurate, because here we have, but we feel the pressure of the authority of Jerome, which I should certainly not wish to disparage, although he is frequently violent, shameless, fickle, and inconsistent. However, I do not quite understand what Jerome means at this point. So it doesn't really help us when it's like he's frequently violent, shameless, fickle, and inconsistent. So luckily for us, we do have the Latin translation. Sorry, it goes before it. So here. So I'm going to throw this into Google Translate. Google Translate. Now, sometimes Latin doesn't work well on Google Translate, which is quite sad. Language. So, okay, here we have. So it might be a fine way of translating it, but just when I see those type of words, I'm like, is there a bias there? Because I know that this is how they sell Nostradamus books. They twist the Latin to make it sound like he's prophesying when he's not, or he's talking about Hitler when it's just some sort of word that sounds like Hitler. I'll enlarge in this. But let us be vindicated by the authority of Jerome, whom indeed I do not wish to excommunicate, although he is often violent and a little shy, often mischievous, and a little consistent with himself, yet I do not quite see what he means in this place. Okay. So it does have the word violent there. Now, violentes. Okay, so it is a word that would be related.
Sed vergemur autoritate ironimi, quam equidem noli meleuare, quamquam ille saepe numero violentus est, parunque pudens, saepe varius, parunque sibi constans. Tamen non satis video quid sibi velit hoc loco Hieronymus.
Violentus, so violent, vehemus, impetuous, forcible, vehement, aggressive. So it would seem like it would be a bit better saying aggressive or forcible rather than violent. I mean, what's Jerome just punching holes in the walls? Like, let us be vindicated by the authority of Jerome, whom indeed I did not wish to excommunicate or leave off, although he is often violent, although he is often aggressive and a little shy, often mischievous, and little consistent with himself. Okay. Well, let's just go back and we'll just read through that, and then I'll just continue on. But we feel the pressure of the authority of Jerome. So this is Erasmus. He's saying, Jerome, in his Latin, he clearly has the comma, and also the preface of Jerome says that people were taking out the comma Johannine. So he was saying that unjust men, people who didn't believe in the Trinity, they were erasing this verse. And what's interesting is that even, I think it's Codex Fuldensis is a Latin manuscript that has the introduction that Jerome wrote. So it's in like the 5th century. It's in the 6th century actually. So it's in the 6th century. It has this forward to the Bible and says that people are taking the comma out. But then when you actually go to the text, the comma is taken out, which is quite interesting. And that's one of the reasons why people like Erasmus and Stephanus Beza and others, they were very careful to read commentaries, to look at what was said in prefaces, and to look at all the surrounding material around Bibles. And so sometimes you'll have, a main reading, and it's wrong, but in the commentary, it's got the correct reading. And then it might have even a picture or something of an angel, and underneath it's got, again, the correct reading. So someone has changed the text. So sometimes what you see is people will faithfully translate or copy or translate a commentary, but they mightn't faithfully copy or translate the Bible. And sometimes the reverse. Sometimes you'll have the Bible is correctly translated or copied, but then you'll have the commentary, they're trying to change it. But it is harder to change the commentary because usually you've got a whole theme. You'll have 20 lines of just talking about one word. How do you just amend that to one or two words here and there to change it? It can be hard. And so but sometimes they're faithful in the commentary and in the text. But where there's textual variance, that's why Erasmus was looking at all of these things. So we feel the pressure and authority of Jerome, which I should certainly not wish to disparage or throw out. Although he is frequently violent, he's aggressive in his writing nature, I guess, shameless, fickle, and inconsistent. However, I do not quite understand what Jerome means at this point. So he's got a number 1 there. So let's go down here. Erasmus made similar comments about Jerome in his Responsio ad Annotationis Lee Novus. So that's his letters to Lee. And we'll probably go through them as well at a later point. So Shati is in the house. He says, grace and peace. It's pretty odd that he started putting these Ruckmanite videos after Ruckman passed. Yeah, or it is hard. I run the Exposing Peter Ruckman site. And, he passed away, but we still kept writing about him and his teachings and things like that. And so it is hard because sometimes something very influential. It's like Michael Heiser at the moment. I'm not sure if he has actually passed away or he's in his last days, but it's hard to talk about that sort of thing when people's emotions are running high and they're like, he's a faithful man of God. And I'm like, well, he's a false prophet. Anyway, let's just continue here. I shall record his words. So he's talking about Jerome. But just as we corrected the evangelists some time ago according to the rule of truth, we have likewise, with God's help, restored these Catholic epistles to their proper state. So he has another footnote there. The phrase Dio Juvante occurs nowhere in Jerome's extant authentic works. Okay, so that's where Brantley McDowell feels that is not a genuine reading of Jerome, but Erasmus was reading it, saying it was. And the next one just is these words cited against Erasmus by Lee, so it's not really that important. So that's the next footnote. So I'll just read that bit again. But just as we corrected the evangelists some time ago, according to the rule of truth, we have likewise, with God's help, restored these Catholic epistles to their proper state. Now, there's one thing, this is just a side issue. I actually don't like the label Catholic epistles. The more that I deal with Roman Catholics, the more that I realize that they do use this term Catholic. When Protestants are using it, people who were labeled Protestants, anyone who's not Catholic, when they say, the Catholic epistles or, the Catholic Church, because I remember reading William Booth material and he's like the universal or the Catholic Church. And I'm like, what? When I was first a Christian and then, asked a few people and they're like, no, it just means universal. But every time I see Catholic, I'm just, the average layman just sees Catholic and thinks Roman Catholic, And so I would rather say they're just the universal epistles, or I would actually change that name because, people talk about, false friends in the Bible and all this sort of stuff. Well, there can be in academia some, we go to Wikipedia and you look up anyone and they're a pope, apparently. The Catholics have just, put their tag on everything and that's how it is. So anyway, I just sort of bring that up as a bit of a side issue that's something I'm probably going to, for the rest of my life, just go, I don't like. It's like with the early church writers. I specifically say it's the early church writers rather than the early church fathers, because some of these people, they're not my father. They're not, I don't have anything to do with them, but they can write things of interest, but I would not follow their ministry. Just as like, I'm sure the Encyclopedia Britannica has interesting things. You chew the meat and you spit the bones. But it doesn't mean I'm tied to them in any way or I have my roots. See, a lot of people want to, when they're exposing cults, they go back through the roots of, they're related to the, Jehovah's Witnesses are related to the Seventh-day Adventists, related to the Millerites, related to this group, that group, and they keep going back down. And if you are some sort of branch off in between there, you're off the wall, I've had people try and do that genealogical type of thing with me, where I'm just like, I'm a Christian. It's like, who's your pastor? It's like, Jesus. Which group are you with? Oh, we run Revolution Church. Who's the main guy? Me. Okay. And it just does their head in because it's like they want to throw you in they want to pigeonhole you, and just like they're obsessed with calling us Ruckmanites and all the rest of it, or Gippites or Ripplingerites and things that we're definitely not. They want to throw you into some sort of bag with all these poison snakes, and you're like, I don't fit that. Anyway, side issue. The first is a single letter by James, then 2 of Peter, 3 by John, and 1 by Jude. Okay, so this is still Jerome speaking, okay? So, which is interesting. If we were to look at, it talks about the book of James, 2 of Peter. It doesn't say 1 of Peter and 1 written by an anonymous guy, the whole forged concept of Bart Ehrman. 3 by John, not 1 by John. First John, yeah, that's from John. The other 2 aren't. And 1 by Jude. Okay, it's very interesting. So this is Jerome. If the letters were also rendered faithfully by translators into Latin, just as their authors composed them, they would not cause the reader confusion, nor would the differences between their wording give rise to contradictions, nor would the various phrases contradict each other, especially in that place where we read the clause about the unity of the Trinity in the first letter of John. So this is Erasmus quoting Jerome, okay? Indeed, it has come to our notice that in this letter some unfaithful translators have gone far astray from the truth of the faith. For in their edition, they provide just the words for 3 witnesses, namely water, blood, and spirit, and omit the testimony of the Father, the Word, and the Spirit, by which the Catholic faith, or universal faith, is especially strengthened, and proof is tendered of the single substance of divinity possessed by the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. End quote of Jerome, of Erasmus quoting Jerome in his annotations. So very, very interesting there. So we see that Jerome is basically saying there are these, it's come to our notice that there are unfaithful translators, and they've gone far astray from the truth of the faith, and they're only putting in the water, blood, and spirit, and they omit the testimony of the Father, Word, and Spirit. So this is a guy writing this in the 4th century. And, well, when was the Vulgate written? Was it 410? So I guess early 5th century. But you're looking at around, the same time that it's claimed that Codex Vaticanus and Sinaiticus were made. And he's talking about unfaithful scribes, deleting these words. And so it's quite amazing. This is a very strong, case for the comma. Ishati says, I believe King James used that term Catholic in his writings, but not referring. Yeah, most people right up until just recently have used the word Catholic. And for most people, they haven't had a problem with it. But I just find today it has this connotation of Roman Catholic. And I just find when I'm going through material, sometimes people, they do pull up the Catholic thing, and they know that some people balk at it. And I just find, like here it says, which the Catholic faith is especially strengthened. Now, you imagine if you're a new Christian and I just read through this and I'm like, the Catholic faith is strengthened. So what is he, does this support the Roman Catholic Church? But then you have to sort of, because I had to unlearn certain things. And, my uncle was a Jesuit. And so a lot of my family Roman Catholic, and so learning that type of thing and thinking that Christianity is Catholic, and then becoming a Christian and going, oh, it's not. And everywhere I see the term Catholic, it just stands out like a sore thumb. I'm sure that other people don't. It doesn't happen to them at all, but for me it does, and I'm sure that it does happen to other people. And so that's why I'm just like, well, we can just change that to universal. It's synonymous, and that's what I'm going to do. So, yeah, so I find this quote very interesting, and I'll just go down and read this. It says, these words had been cited against Erasmus by Lee, see Erasmus 1520. And so Lee had actually used this argument. And sometimes I find too, like even with this thing with TurretinFan, sometimes like I don't really think there's anything he's changed my mind on. Not that I can think of. He strengthened my stance on marginal notes, just because he just seems to just overlook everything I'm saying on that. On unicorn, absolutely strengthen my stance, pretty much everything that we debated on. And when it comes to Easter, it's sort of like, because I know that he's coming to this issue not knowing my side, not knowing Will Kinney's side or Scott Jones's side, and he's going through it and going, oh, okay, but fighting against it the whole time. But it is good. It has been good to have someone on the other side, to a contra. I find usually if I put something on Facebook and no one debates it, no one argues against it, you just sort of left there going, man, I really wanted someone to come along and say, hey, that's completely wrong. And especially someone who knows their stuff, because you want to check too. And sometimes with Easter, I've had people on the Textus Receptus Academy or the Textus Receptus, the other page that I run that has like 7,000 people on it. Sometimes people are like, well, no, this is wrong, or they'll take the Bryan Ross approach where it's like, no, it's just, they were using Easter and Passover interchangeably all the way up till 1611, and then for some reason it just sort of Easter won out, where I'm like, no, that change happened before 1611, and they put these words in the correct semantic range. One, that's a trend that Tyndale started with in the New Testament. He used Easter, he used Passover in the Old Testament. So eventually that came to they're looking at, or after the cross, because that's when the New Covenant was ratified after the resurrection. And so obviously Easter being the New Covenant, Passover being the Old Covenant. But going through all this stuff and listening to TurretinFan talk about all this, it's solidified in my mind a lot of these concepts. And so, he's gone a whole bunch of different routes. And usually what I find is people default to the Bryan Ross position, because that way you don't have to deal with too many issues, because you're just saying, oh, it's an old archaic way of saying Passover, which it was in the previous Bible. So that's it. But when you're actually saying, no, this is big, because they had a celebration called Easter, and it was a celebration of the resurrection, so they've deliberately put it in there. You're going out on a limb saying those type of specific, very specific things. And so you can come under fire from anyone. And what I find is after 1611, that's when it was probably in like 50 years of 1611, people started talking about this pagan goddess and all the rest of it, saying the King James is wrong. And I find a lot of the enemies of the King James position are these Puritans. And you read through the material, and they're very venomous against the King James. So I know a lot of people go, well, the King James is high church and Anglican and all this. I would be a Puritan too, coming against it. Yeah, but the thing is, you can be coming against truth. As much as I don't agree with all, the Anglican Church and all that was happening back then, and some people believe in whataboutism of babies and pedobaptism, but I do recognize when someone's done a superior job to others in their translation, in their linguistic abilities, in the way that they've brought words across. Every time I've studied into what the King James translators have done, I'm left in awe, and I'm like, these guys knew what they were doing. And so, and I just find that a lot of the argumentation against them is very poor from that era. And so, some Puritans, they're writing things and they're saying, like even the whole, Bancroft changed, 15 places or 14 places or whatever. And you go through it and it's like, none of it's really of any substance. Bishopric and things like that. It's like, it's almost like the people who are accusing the translators of not translating properly, they didn't really know the languages well themselves. They weren't that well educated. But some people just cyber them because it's, they're Puritans. That's part of our group, sort of thing. Anyway, I'm talking about Erasmus and the comma. So let's go from this point here. So that was the end of Jerome speaking. Erasmus continues, we have repeated Jerome's words to this point, from which it is clear that Jerome was not complaining about Greek codices, simply about those who translated the Greek into Latin. But precisely that which Jerome complains was omitted, is now absent from the Greek manuscripts, whereas it is present in the Latin manuscripts, though not all of them. I think the estimate is 95% of the Latin have the comma. So someone like Scrivener said out of every 50 manuscripts we have of Latin, 49 of them have the comma. So from where does Jerome correct the error of the translators? Clearly from the Greek manuscripts. But they either had what we have translated or another reading. So this is the thing. What Erasmus is saying is, well, okay, Jerome is making this claim. He's saying that there are unfaithful translators who are bringing across from Greek into Latin. They're saying that it's only the water, the blood, and the Spirit, but they're neglecting the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. They're deleting these words. So what standard would Jerome be using here? Obviously, he would be using the Greek manuscripts as a standard. So this would show that in Jerome's day, the manuscripts had it in it, the Greek manuscripts. And I know that there are a lot of text critics, they do claim to know what's happened in the first 400 years of Christianity. So when I was debating Stephen Boyce, he said, oh, you guys are interested in the last 400 years, in the King James and everything. I'm interested in the first 400 years, which sounds nice. But the thing is, you're dealing with fragmentary evidence. You're dealing sometimes, I think it was Peter Van Cleek said it's for the first 6 centuries. There's I think he said maybe 6 chapters of Mark that are just not in anything. So a whole 6 chapters of Mark that aren't in anything for 6. I know I'm butchering these numbers, but it was something big like that. And he said, so you can't find out what was written in the first 4 centuries. You have to go after that. And we're talking about Greek manuscripts, of course. And that was one of the things when I was talking about Revelation 16:5. There was only 4 manuscripts before the 10th century that had this reading in Greek. So obviously you have to go to the Latin and you have to check these other things and to get older. And then when you go to the Latin, it's like, oh, it's there. The reading, was and is and shall be is in Beatus of Blood Banner. It's in Hamo Halberstadensis. It's in other writings. And so this is one of the issues where they're dealing with fragmentary evidence, but they make out that they've got this wealth of information that the early church had. And when you go through the early quotations of the early church writers, they're oftentimes quoting the comma. We see, we've gone through a lot of these things in our videos. We see allusions, like Tertullian, but we see direct quotations. Origen, he directly quoted it. And then we look at Cyprian, and then we look at other people throughout history, and we see that this was constantly quoted. And even here, this is Jerome quoting, even just him speaking about the Father, Son, and the Holy Spirit being omitted. He's saying that it's in the Greek manuscript. So this is a huge point, and this is a point that Erasmus is making here. He's saying, where was his authority in saying this? It's not okay. It's present in the Latin manuscripts. He's saying this was the reading in Greek. He's saying that this is translated into the Latin, and that there are unfaithful translators into the Latin, omitting it. But when we look at the Latin, it's most of it has it. But what we're looking at is the Greek. What's happened with the Greek? And he says clearly, maybe I should do the TurretinFan and go, oh, you're saying clearly again. It's not that clear, but it's like, no, clearly from the Greek manuscripts, obviously from the Greek manuscripts. but they either had what we have translated or another reading. If another reading, in agreement with the Latin Vulgate version, what are his grounds for showing which of the two readings is more correct, or which written by the apostle, especially since what he reproaches is what was then in the public usage of the church? If this were not the case, I cannot see how the following passage fits. And then we've got a page of Latin. But you, I'm going to throw this into Google. It's one of the best ways to get the proper names of things, or how to say it. Throw it into Google Translate.
Eustochium.
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 But you, Eustochium, Virgin of Christ, by asking me so persistently for the true readings of Scripture, you are in a way exposing me in my old age to be gnawed by the teeth of those who bear me ill will and who call me a corrupter of the sacred Scriptures. Okay, so that's a quotation. Who would have called him a forger unless he had changed the public reading? Okay, so let's just go down. The argument repeated from Erasmus Responsio ad annotationis lei novos, and in large part verbatim. Okay, so it's hard for me to know exactly what's being said here. I'm going to check this word out. Okay. Eustochium. This word.
Eustochium.
Eustochium. Eustochium. Circa 368, September 28th, 419 or 420. Born Eustochium Julia at Rome, is also venerated as a saint, and was an early desert mother. Eustochium was the daughter of Paula of Rome, and the third of four daughters of the Roman senator Toxoticus, who for Jerome made a number of disputable claims of ancestry. After the death of her husband around 380, Paula and her daughter Eustochium lived in Rome as austere as life as fathers of the desert. Eustochium had three sisters, those ones, and a brother. So yeah, that's interesting. So there's this relationship with Rome here. Now I feel like I have to read this to actually, or else we're just going to not know why this Eustochium person is mentioned. Now some of you might know this, I don't. So in 386, so this is just Wikipedia if you're listening along. So I've just Googled this Eustochium. So in 386, they accompanied Jerome on his journey to Egypt, where they visited the hermits of the Nitrian desert in order to study and afterward imitate their mode of life. In the fall of the same year, they returned to Palestine and settled permanently at Bethlehem. Paula and Eustochium, every time I forget how to say it, Eustochium. I've got to write it down because I'm going to just. Okay, how would you say it? Eustochium. Eustochium. I'll look over there. Paula and Eustochium at once began to erect 4 monasteries and a hospice near the spot where Christ was born. While the erection of the monasteries was in process, 386 to 89, they lived in a small building in the neighborhood. One of the monasteries was occupied by monks put under the direction of Jerome. The 3 other monasteries were taken by Paula and Eustochium and the numerous virgins that flocked around them. The three convents, you notice it's very Catholic, this type of wording. It's a hospice, it's the monks, the three convents, which were under the supervision of Paula, had only one oratory, where the virgins met several times a day for prayer and the liturgy of the hours. Jerome testifies that Eustochium and Paula performed the most menial services. Much of their time they spent in the study of Scripture under the direction of Jerome. Eustochium spoke Latin and classical Greek with equal ease and was able to read the Scriptures in the Hebrew text. Many of Jerome's biblical commentaries owe their existence to her influence, and to her he dedicated his commentaries on the prophets Isaiah and Ezekiel. The letters which Jerome wrote for her instruction and spiritual advancement are, according to his own testimony, very numerous. After the death of Paula in 404, Eustochium assumed the direction of the nunneries, and as it's called a nunnery now. Her task was a different one on account of the impoverished condition of the temporal affairs, which was brought about by the lavish almsgiving of Paula. Jerome was of great assistance to her by his encouragement and prudent advice. In 417, a crowd of ruffians attacked and pillaged the monasteries of Bethlehem, destroyed one of them by fire, besides killing and maltreating some of the residents, and it is alleged that this was instigated by John II. So he was the Bishop of Jerusalem, so he was another church guy. The Patriarch of Jerusalem and the Pelagians, against whom Jerome had written, that were considered sharp polemics. Both Jerome and Eustochium informed Pope Innocent I by letter of the occurrence. So I don't think popes were really around back in this era. To me, the first real person you could probably call a pope was probably Pope Gregory around 602. But I could be wrong there. This is just, I haven't really looked into this a lot. By letter of the occurrence, who severely reproached the Patriarch for having permitted the outrage. Eustochium died shortly after and was succeeded in the supervision of the convents by her niece, the younger Paula. Eustochius of Tours might have been her nephew, and further lateral descendants may include Perpetuus and Volucenius. The Catholic Church celebrates. So she's obviously a saint. So you can probably chant to her, chant to the dead people, like the Catholics love for you to do. It's not good to do that. It opens up your spirit to the demonic. Okay, so let's have a look in context here. So we said earlier, clearly from the Greek manuscripts, but they either had what we have translated or another reading, if another reading in agreement with the Latin Vulgate version. What are his grounds for showing which of the two readings is more correct, or which written by the apostle, especially since what he reproaches is what was then the public usage of the church? If this were not the case, I cannot see how the following passage fits. Okay, so then that's all written in Latin there, what we're going to read. But you, Eustochium, Virgin of Christ, by asking me so persistently for the true readings of Scripture, you are in a way exposing me to my old age to be gnawed by the teeth of those who bear me ill will, and who call me a corrupter of the sacred Scriptures. So that's the end of what Jerome is saying. Who would have called him a forger unless he had changed the public reading? Okay, so I'm not sure which way to take that. He's saying this Eurostockium, a Eustockium person was constantly saying to Jerome, yeah, I want the true readings of Scripture. And it says that people are saying he's a corrupter of the sacred Scriptures. And Erasmus is taking that. He's saying, who would have called him a forger unless he had changed the public reading? So he's saying, why would have they had said that against him? Okay, so let's look at the note here. So yeah, we've read that. That's the that's found in his debate with Lee. Well, let's just move on and we'll see if it brings a little bit more light here. But I think it was good to go through the Wikipedia article and just sort of clear up who this person was, who I'd never heard of before. A Eustockium. I keep saying Euro. A Eustockium.
Eustocium.
Eustocium. So if Cyril amongst the Greeks read what the Greek codices have now, and if Augustine Bede among the Latins read only this, or both readings, I do not understand what argument Jerome can bring to show that the reading he hands down to us is genuine. Perhaps someone will say this is an effective weapon against the Arians, but firstly, since it is certain that the reading varied both in Greek and in Latin traditions, this weapon will be worthless against them, who would doubtless with equal justification claim for themselves whichever reading serves their cause. But imagine that the reading is not in dispute, since what is said about the testimony of the water, blood, and spirit being one refers not to an identity of nature, but to an agreement in testimony. Do we really think that the Arians would be so stupid as not to apply the same interpretation to the Father, the Word, and the Spirit here? Especially since Orthodox writers give the same interpretation to a similar passage in the Gospels. Since Augustine does not reject this interpretation in his diatribe against the Arian Maximinus, and since an interlinear fragment of the Glossa Ordinaria interprets this way, and then it has these three are one, says the Glossa, that is testifying about the same thing. So it has down the bottom here, Glossa Ordinaria, 1603, 1414. The interlinear gloss actually says Unus Deus de Edium Re Testentes. On Erasmus and the Glossa Ordinaria, see Young, Hank de Jong, 1975. Okay. So the 301 says the Glossa. That is testifying about the same thing. So there's a lot in there where I'm not really understanding that much. The debate between Augustine and the Arians, that's interesting. I'd have to look more into that. Satisfying ourselves with little phrases like that does not amount to strengthening the faith, but rendering it more suspect. Perhaps it might be preferable to conduct ourselves in pious pursuits in order to be united with God than to engage in hair-splitting debates about how the Son is distinguished from the Father and how the Spirit differs from them both. I, for one, do not see how the view rejected by the Arians can be upheld with the help of speculative readings. So it has, that is the Orthodox view of the Trinity. So that's the footnote. But finally, since this entire passage is obscure, it does not have much power to refute heretics. But we have responded to our our calumniator. So a calumniator is someone who is against you on this matter rather than fully with the apologia, than with a like a defense. So I guess Erasmus is sort of saying, look, we're just responding to the claims against us. We haven't really expounded on what this verse means. We just, it's there, and we're just saying that people who think it shouldn't be there, that these are the reasons why we think it's there, regardless of where the coins fall, where you know, regardless of what that equates to in theology. I assume that's what he's saying. Okay. So I'm pretty sure this is the last page. Maybe not. Okay. One thing I shall add, though, my dear Stonica. So Stonica, he was part of the Complutensian polyglot guys. So I'll just jump up here. Stonica. Diego Lopez de Zúñiga, theologian. And so he worked for Cardinal Jimenez de Cisneros, and they produced the Complutensian polyglot. So that came out, or that was finalized in 1514 with the New Testament, and it wasn't released until 1522. So Stonica, he would write to Erasmus quite a bit, and they would talk about these type of issues. Now, the Complutensian guys, they loved Erasmus. They wanted him to work on their project. They felt that he would be very beneficial to them. So has Zúñiga controverted Erasmus on a number of points of biblical translation. A contemporary view is that while at times he defended the Latin Vulgate excessively, he made valid points on some other cases and showed up deficiencies of Erasmus, who lacked the same command of Hebrew and Aramaic. Okay, that's one person's point of view. But I mean, when you look at the letters between these people and Erasmus, oftentimes they're praising him, saying, "Come and join us." And his response was, "I don't like Spain." And I think he actually knew that if he continued on the way he was going, he was probably going to end up burnt at the stake. So I think being in Spain with the Spanish Inquisition was probably not the best place for someone who, or later on, I think it was 1527, they had the Council of Valladolid, I think it is, where they were asking questions, is he a heretic or not? So it was like a heretic trial without Erasmus there, which is quite interesting. So that would be another thing that we'll have to go through. So let's continue on here. So I'll just read through this again. One thing I shall add, though my dear Stonica so often boasts of his Rhodian Codex, so that would be an interesting one to look at, to which he attributes such authority, he has strangely not adduced it as an oracle here, especially since it almost agrees with our Latin codices so well that it might seem to be a lesbian straight edge. Okay, so let's go back up to the Latin, and we'll translate this. I will add, since my Stonica often throws the Rhodian Codex, to which it only gives authority, strange especially that he had not brought his oracle here, since it so nearly agrees with our codices that the rule of lesbia may be seen. Okay, so let's look at lesbia, maybe somewhere like lesbian feminism. I want to look at that. Lesbia was the literary pseudonym used by the poet Gaius Valerius Catullus in 82 to 52 BC to refer to his lover. Lesbia is traditionally identified with Clodia. Okay. So it sounds like it's sort of, he's using this type of old poetic wording to talk about this person, Lesbia, who doesn't sound like, she was just someone who's into girls, but more so it's a pseudonym used by the Roman poet to refer to his lover. Okay, so this Roman poet had a lover, Gaius Catullus, and he just, instead of using his lover's real name, he just called her Lesbia. Okay, so I'm just going to check the etymology. No, I don't want to look at that one. Search instead for that one. No, I will have to. If you don't want something to come up in your search, you put a minus in front of it in the word, and that won't come up. Okay. It means a woman from Lesbos in Latin. Lesbos being a Greek island in the northeastern Aegean Sea, which was home to a circle of young girl lovers, including Sappho. The name was often used by the poet Catullus as a pseudonym for the woman he loved, who was commonly identified as Clodia Metelli. Okay. Okay, it's like a bird. All right, well, he does have a footnote there. Lesbia regula, and then he's got Latin here. This paragraph is taken from Erasmus's Apologia ad Annotationis Stonicae. Let's see Hank de Jong's notes to this passage for further information on Erasmus's sources. Okay, so I guess if I type in the 2, maybe something will come up better together rather than just having the separate words. Okay. So it says here, oh, I did click on it. Oh, it's a doc. Okay. In Attica, Erasmus included an image that came to be widely used in debates of the Reformation, that of the flexible lesbian rule. It has not previously been noted that the phrase appears in three distinct senses in the early modern period, partly following lines of profession and religion. In the Nicomachean Ethics, Aristotle uses the image to discuss equity in law. By the lesbian rule, it is said when things are done the wrong way around, when theory is accommodated to fact and not fact to theory, when law is suited to conduct and not conduct corrected by law. Okay, so it's quite a long article there about that. So it seems like it was a common thing to say back in the day. So it just sounds like it's a bit of a word meaning sort of like the cart before the horse sort of thing. It's gone backwards. So let's just read that through and we'll see if that definition fits. One thing I shall add, though my dear Stonica often boasts of his Rhodian Codex, to which he attributes such authority, he has strangely not adduced it as an oracle here, especially since it almost agrees with our Latin codices so well that it might seem to be a lesbian straight edge or the horse before the cart. Okay, that makes sense. However, lest I should keep anything hidden, there has been found in England one single Greek manuscript which occurs. What is lacking in the commonly accepted texts is written as follows, and it's got the Greek there, hotres esin homotoriontes entu uranu pater logos kai pneuma kai oti otres en esin kai tres esin maturiontes en tega pneuma uda kai ama. And then it has eten maturion ton anthropon, okay, etc. Now we go down to number 2 here. So we don't actually, I won't read this yet because I don't want it to taint what we're reading, because this is quite a big explanation and sometimes it can be like critical text. Yeah, it's just going to have a few anecdotes in there, and we'll just finish what we're reading here because we want to keep that pure. Then we'll go down and we'll check out what Grantley McDonald says about it. So he says, although I am sure if it is by accident that phrase and these three are unto one, which is found in our Greek manuscripts, is not repeated at this point, i.e., that is in verse 8. Therefore, restored from this British Codex what was said to be lacking in our editions, lest anyone should have any handle to blame me unjustly. Okay, so that's interesting. So he's saying he's found this manuscript. So this has always been one of my things. I've wanted to check exactly what is said in Codex. So this is usually attributed to Codex Montfortianus. Okay, this is the manuscript that James White went to Dublin, to Trinity Library in Dublin, and they've looked at it, so it makes him an expert on it. Apparently, it's like going and seeing the relics. You've seen the relic, and so you've got some sort of special power. James White goes and looks at P52, and he's the expert on it. Apparently, Okay, so let's look at some of these. So we have a footnote here at the end of the Greek, and we have a footnote here at the end of the at the end where he said that he's included it. Now, let's just read through this. This information on the reading of the British Codex was first given in Erasmus's Apologia ad Eternitas Stonicae. I won't read the Latin from now on. I'll just stick with the English, where Erasmus, or the compositor, in his haste, made 4 errors recording the manuscript reading. The reading of Montfortianus is as follows. The points where Erasmus makes an error in the Apologia and the Annotationis are underlined. Okay, so we see agion here. So it has pneuma agion. I think the difference is agion pneuma. Okay, so he's showing where there's differences in what Erasmus has actually written from Montfortianus. So this is one of the things I've always been sus on Montfortianus, whether it's a genuine, whether this is the British Codex or not, because sometimes we realize that these manuscripts can just go, they can just disappear, especially something that's famous and there's controversy around it. Next thing you know, it's just gone. But it could be. I'm on the fence here going, okay, let's look at the information. So the K is erroneously added here in the Apologia, but removed from the Annotationis. Erasmus's removal of the erroneously inserted K in the Annotationis indicates that he realized that the reading he had given in the Apologia was faulty. This eventually prompted him to check the manuscript and insert the reading from the comma directly into the text of the New Testament, for the reading there reproduces perfectly that given in Montfortianus. However, he apparently forgot to make the appropriate correction to the Annotationis. Despite what has been asserted since Li Long, 1720, this statement is true. In his 1522 edition, Erasmus splices the comma as it appears in Montfortianus up to the word pneuma in verse 8 into the reading he had given in his 1516 and 1519 editions on the expression answer, and that's all in Latin. So apparently he's cited this in the Annotationis, but in the what's written in his actual text is different from this. But he also had another place where in his Apologia where he's talked about this as well, and it's got some differences as well, or the K, or the which is just a conjunction and is added erroneously. Okay. Okay, so that's interesting. Let me see. Oh, actually, I read 3 there. Sorry, I thought that was part of the same issue. Okay. Well, that's the end of Erasmus's notes, or is it? No, it's not. Okay, so let's. No, it's not. We got quite a bit to go. Heaps to go. I was thinking, did that come up quick? All right, so we've looked at Stunica. He's talking about the Rhodian Codex. Then we're talking about this other one, which is now known as Codex Montfortianus. Or back then it was just called the British Codex. It was found in England. And it's sort of strange. I do find the more I converse with critical text people, anything from England just seems like it's just tainted. If you find a manuscript in England, it's like, oh, it's in England, but if you found it in Paris, it's like, oh, okay, that's fine. It's almost like the whole woke thing of hating old white people who made the King James Bible, or why it's just this male-dominated patriarchy sort of thing, and to have something like the British Codex. I mean, Britain had lots of manuscripts. They had lots of early church influence. And so whether it's in Latin or French or German or English is just as strong a witness. And so this is a Greek manuscript in Britain. And so usually this just gets said that it was made to order. This is usually James White's apologetic is they just made it to order. He said, I can't put it in because I haven't got a manuscript. And someone just turned up, a few months later and went, there you go. They just wrote it all out really hurriedly and made a whole bunch of mistakes. And, and he's like, I made a promise now. I have to keep it. That's not what he says here. He says, however, lest I should keep anything hidden, there has been found in England one single manuscript, which occurs what is lacking in the commonly accepted text. So he doesn't talk about, this whole rash wager type of thing, which has been thoroughly debunked. So let's move on to the next part. So we're in the Latin there. He says, however, I suspect that this codex was adapted to agree with the manuscripts of the Latins. So he's saying it's probably a back translation from the Latin. And so the footnote here says, Erasmus was evidently aware, even before seeing the Complutensian Bible, but we're not sure if he saw the Complutensian Bible or not, because Stonica was in communication with Erasmus, and having the 600 New Testaments just sitting there in Spain, he could write to these guys and get any answer that he wanted from Stonica. And who was the other guy? I can't remember the name of the other Complutensian guy who was in contact. Sepultiva? Was it Sepultiva? I think it was. Or was he the guy in the Vatican? Anyway, so he was evidently aware, even before seeing the Complutensian Bible, that Aquinas suggested that the phrase "and these three are one" was added by Arians to make it seem that their unity was only one of testimony or intention, not one of essence. As a result, this phrase was subsequently omitted from many Latin Bibles. Okay, so the unusual omission of this phrase in the Greek text of the British Codex made Erasmus suspect its authenticity. So where it has "and these three are one." Okay, so that was the issue. All right. I've consulted two extraordinarily old manuscripts in the library of St. Donation in Bruges. Neither had the testimony of the Father, Word, and Spirit. One of them did not even have the phrase "on earth." Simply, there are three that bear witness: the Spirit, the water, and the blood. And so that's got a footnote number 2. The information of the codices in Bruges is first mentioned in Erasmus's Apologia ad Anatotianis Stanicae. Hank de Jong notes that this passage refers to a visit to Bruges in August 1521. This passage was written in September 1521. Okay. So in the 1527, it has this written. In both copies at Constance, after the testimony of the water, the blood, and the Spirit was added, the testimony of the Father, Word, and the Spirit, with these words, just as in heaven there are three, the Father, Word, and Spirit, and the three are one. Neither the words give testimony nor the pronoun these were added. In the copy available for view at the Public Library of the University of Basel, the testimony of the Spirit, water, and blood does not occur. Okay. So additionally, Paolo Bombassi, so that's Bombassius, who James White talks about quite a lot. He got the readings from Bombassius, and But Erasmus lived with Bombasius for about a year, I'm pretty sure it was, in Venice. I learned an honest man, so he knew him personally. So he knew a lot of these guys personally. Made a literal transcription of this passage at my request from a very ancient codex in the Vatican Library, in which the testimony of the Father, Word, and Spirit is not mentioned. Now I'll just read this. If the authority of the antiquity impressed you, the book was extremely old. If you are impressed by the authority of the Pope, it is his library from which this witness was sought. Okay, so it has here the information on the Vatican Codex inspected by Bombassi is mentioned in Erasmus's Apologia ad Annotationis Stonicae. Hank de Jong notes a letter from Bombassi containing this information. It's dated 18th of June, 1521. And then it says, the Aldine edition agrees with this reading. What Lorenzo Valla read is not entirely clear. Okay, so the Aldine edition, so the 1518 edition agrees with the reading of what was in the Vatican, in the Pope's library. This is usually seen as Codex Vaticanus. So what Lorenzo Valla had, Lorenzo Valla was, he lived about 50 years before Erasmus, and he was saying that we really need to tidy up the Latin. It's gone, there's lots of mistakes in it, and copy mistakes and errors, but he had his own Annotationis, and that was printed by Erasmus as well. So he was a bit of a forerunner for Erasmus, but he died before, Erasmus got famous or anything like that. Lee had argued that if this variant was so important, it would have been mentioned by Valla, who had seen 7 codices of the Greek text. See Erasmus 1520, 200 to 201. In his reply to Lee, and when we're looking at this, this is just the way that books of Erasmus are coded. So sometimes you might have LB, which is the Leiden bibliothèque or whatever. So it's, but yeah, these all mean something to Erasmus scholars. In his reply to Lee, Erasmus points out that Valla was a fallible human and that he himself had seen more than Valla's 7 codices, all of them lacking the comma. Okay. So we've got to think this is Erasmus speaking. So in this page, he's saying basically Codex, what is known as Codex Montfortianus, or back then it was called the British Codex, whether it's the same or not, I'm undecided yet, but Stephen Avery seems to think it was the same. I suspect that this codex was adapted from the Latin, so it could have been written in from the Latin. And then he's saying he's looked at 2 extraordinarily old manuscripts, and neither had the comma. And in the 1527 edition, he's looking at their copies of Constance, and they added the testimony of the Father, Word, the Holy Spirit. There was no give testimony. So he's going through the manuscript evidence here. In a copy available to the public library of Basel, the Spirit, the Water, and the Blood doesn't even occur. And Bombasius, he gave him information about the Father, the Word, and the Spirit not being in what is probably Codex Vaticanus being talked about here, most probably. And he's saying it's an old manuscript that the Pope himself is sort of has in his own library. But what's interesting, Complutense and Polyglot guys didn't use this. And so then he's talking about the Aldine and saying Lorenzo Valla, or talking about Aldine, that agrees with that reading of Vaticanus, and Lorenzo Valla. What Lorenzo Valla read is not entirely clear. So what's interesting, he's saying the Aldine agrees with that reading. So perhaps he's actually hinting that the Aldine guys, Aldus, he was very well respected, and Bombasius, he was, friends of Erasmus, friends with Aldus. So when he became the curator of the Vatican Library, perhaps, he knew of this manuscript, or perhaps it was used by Aldus for some readings. I'm not really sure. So, but usually people just say, "Oh, the Aldine edition is just Erasmus's edition," which I'm yet to disprove, but it doesn't sit right with me. But we'll go with wherever the information leads. So in the meantime, the Spanish edition has been brought to me, which conflicts with the rest, for it reads as follows. So this is still under his 1527. So it has 1527 up here. So he's saying, in the meantime, the Spanish edition has been brought to me. So the Spanish edition will be the Complutensian Polyglot. Okay. And so it's got the Greek there. For all the exemplar which the Spanish had followed, which, if I'm not mistaken, they obtained from the very same library. This is number one there. I'll read that in a minute. It differs from the British Codex in this respect, that the articles are added, Pater, Logos, to Pneuma, which were not given in the British Codex. That's why some people say it's a back translation from the Latin. Erasmus seems to be saying that as well. Secondly, where the British Codex has ote or tres, the Spanish exemplar simply has qui otres. And the same thing happens with the spirit, the water, and the blood in verse 8. Furthermore, where the British Codex has en esse, the Spanish edition gives eis to en esse. So he's pointing out the differences between the Complutensian Polyglot and the British Codex, which some people think is Codex Montfortianus, and it could be. Lastly, where the British Codex added Caho tres eis to en esse, also to the earthly witnesses, this phrase is not added in the Spanish edition, at least not here. I'm quite certain that the phrase eis to en is a Hebraism. That's interesting. I shall be as a father toward him cannot mean anything but I shall be his father. Interesting. Okay. So we've got 3 or 4 footnotes we're going to look up, but I may as well just read this last bit and we'll go back through that. Now, the Spanish edition added a scholium from the Decretals attributed to St. Thomas. It declares that the testimony of the Spirit, the water, and the blood, in carefully copied codices, the phrase "and these three are one," is not added, and that it seems that it was added by those who favored the Arian teaching. So let's look at some of these footnotes here. So that is from the Vatican Library, repository of Codex B, which is Vaticanus, which Erasmus had just mentioned. So he's saying, which, if I'm not mistaken, they obtained from the same library. So this has been one of my contentions, is why didn't the Complutensian guys use Codex Vaticanus if it was such an important document? They rejected it. Erasmus makes, so this is point number 2, Erasmus makes 2 further mistakes in comparing the readings of Montfortianus and the Complutensian edition. Just like the Complutensian edition, Montfortianus lacks the phrase "Caho tres eis to en essin" in 1 John 5:8, as Erasmus had already remarked in the Apologia ad Annotationis Stoicae, and his comments in the 1522 Annotationis just a few lines above. This inconsistency can be explained by the fact that these observations were written at different times. By the time Erasmus saw the Complutensian edition, he no longer had access to Codex Montfortianus, which Clement had taken with him to Italy. By 1527, he had eventually forgotten the phrase "Kehotres eis to en essin" in his text was carried over from 1516 and 1519 editions. This should not be taken as evidence that Montfortianus and Codex Britannicus are different manuscripts, only as proof that even Erasmus sometimes made mistakes. So this is the thing. Erasmus has said, okay, it reads this way, but when you check the manuscript, it doesn't read that way. And that's where people are saying, is Codex Montfortianus just another witness to the comma? But it just so happens to be around the same time. But where is this British Codex? And someone's taken it to Italy. It's gone. and so it'll be interesting to follow that through and where it ended up. Erasmus seems to suggest that the reading in Montfortianus, which contains this apparent Hebraism, looks more trustworthy than that of the Complutensian edition, which lacks it. And then he's got 2 Samuel 7:14 in the Vulgate. Okay, so okay, so most of those footnotes appear here in this. So I'll read that again. Lastly, where the British Codex added Kehotres eis to en essi, also the earthly witnesses, this phrase is not added in the Spanish edition, at least not here. Okay. I'm quite certain that the phrase eis to en is a Hebraism. I shall be as a father toward him cannot mean anything but I shall be his father. Interesting. So I'll read this last bit because I did zip over it. Now, the Spanish edition added a scholium for the decretials attributed by St. Thomas. So the footnote in the Complutensian Polyglot really doesn't have much to do with whether it's genuine or whatever. It just talks about what St. Thomas Aquinas thinks about that. So that's really what the footnote's about. And some people say it was added later, but modern scholars have proven that it couldn't have been added later because they'd already finished these by 1514. They didn't pull them all apart and run them back through the mill and redo them. And so I'm pretty sure there's a good article that came out about 2 years ago explaining this, and I've read it, but I can't remember all the details of it. It declares that in the testimony of the Spirit and the water and the blood, in carefully copied codices, the phrase "and these 301" is not added, and that it seems that this was added by those who favoured the Arian teaching. Okay, so that's why the Complutensian left it out. All right, so let's just keep going through this. We're getting through it. We've gone for 1.5 hours. Now, when I'm reading like this, it does make me very tired. And so I'll probably only go for about 2 hours with this. When I'm just sitting there and watching a video and critiquing it, it's a lot easier. For if it were added here, this is back to Erasmus, and these are talking about the words, and these 3 are one. Okay, so talking about Thomas Aquinas didn't think that they were genuine. If it were added here, it could only be explained as referring to the consensus of their testimony for spirit, water, and blood. Cannot be said to be one in nature, and from this it would follow that the preceding statement 2 concerning the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, and these 3 are one, could be understood as indicating the consensus of their love and witness. Now, with these words, John asserted that the essence of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit is the same. First of all, what they infer is very true, that the nature of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit is most simple and indivisible. If this were not the case, the Son would not really be born from the Father, and the Holy Spirit would not really proceed from the Father and the Son, at any rate as God from the substance of God. So he's getting right into the Trinitarian technicalities there. So far, we have dealt with what can be inferred from the verse, But here we are clearly dealing with the reliability of witnesses, not about the substance of persons. For if this word one in many other places means agreement rather than the unity of an individual, what is so strange in our interpreting it here in a similar way? How often do we read in either testament, one heart, one spirit, one soul, one voice, one mind, and this signifies agreement and mutual love? Since this trope is so familiar in the scriptures, what is stopping us from assuming the same meaning here? In John 10, the Lord says, "The Father and I are one." Okay, so this is getting down to, he's quoting Cyprian here. And so this is one of the things which Stephen Avery pointed out, that he, in his 1521 paraphrase of Scripture, has the comma. And there was a book that he printed which had Cyprian quoting, and these three are one. So he knew clearly about the Cyprian issue. And this is dealing with it right here. I mean, this is exactly what Cyprian quotes here. So I'll just go to that footnote. It has John 10:30. And so that is one of the responses to Lee. But it should just be noted that Cyprian quoted that, and then he said, and John says in his letter, and these three are one. And so it's very clear that John says it, and it's written again, that these three are one. And so it's written just like John wrote in John 10, he wrote it here as well. So this is clear allusion to Cyprian, I believe. How is an Arian going to be vanquished by this evidence unless you tell him that the word one in the scriptures can only mean what is of the same substance? Now, since the scriptures provide innumerable passages which teach that it can be understood as referring to consent or mutual love, I fail to see how far this will help to confirm the opinions of the Orthodox or to repress the stubbornness of the heretic. However, that Christ is speaking there of the concord he has with the Father can be inferred with a high degree of likelihood, since he is not referring to his statement about being one with the Father, but to the fact that he called God his Father, and was thus in an extraordinary fashion calling himself the Son of God. And in John 17 he says, "Holy Father, protect them in your name whom you have given me, so that they may be one as we are one." So that's interesting, because it's using the same type of language about being one, but it's talking about humans being one with God and humans being one with Jesus and with the Father. And so does that make us a member of the Trinity sort of thing? And no, it doesn't. So we have footnote number 2 here, and so that's John 17:11, New Revised Standard Version altered. So he's put in the New Revised Standard Version there. He's altered it to go with what Erasmus has said, but we know the verse there. Okay, so we'll just keep reading. And again, that they may all be one, as you, Father, are in me, and I am in you, may they also be in us. So it's got a footnote number 1, which says John 17:21. This entire passage deals with the consensus of love and witness, and whether we want to or not, we are compelled to interpret that word one in some other way than referring to the divine persons. Therefore, this passage does not constrain us unless the authority of the Orthodox and the prescription of the Church compels us by teaching that this passage cannot be interpreted any other way. For it is pious always to submit our thinking to the judgment of the church as soon as we have heard it make a clear statement. But in the meantime, it is not wicked to investigate the truth, through which causing contention, though without causing contention, as God reveals different things to different people. Okay, so there is a footnote there, which just goes back to that. Okay. But to return to the business of this reading, the evidence we have recalled here shows that the Greek and Latin codices disagree. And in my opinion, there is no danger which reading you embrace. For as to what Thomas says, that the passage was added by heretics, first of all, he does not affirm it. He simply states, it is said that. Okay, so Thomas Aquinas wasn't saying these three are one is added by heretics. He's saying some people are saying this. Okay. Otherwise, the Catholic Church throughout the entire world would embrace what was adulterated by heretics, because this is believed in the Catholic Church. And see, again, I've just read that as Roman Catholic Church, where universal church throughout the entire world. But obviously Erasmus remained within the Catholic Church. So did Tyndale. He was defrocked just before they burnt him. He was a priest up until then. They disfellowshipped Luther, excommunicated him. I don't think he would have made a stand and said, I'm leaving the church or whatever until the day he died. He was trying to reform the church. And so, and most of these people were in their own way trying to do their thing. Erasmus did quite a lot of things. In some things we praise him, in some things we go, well, you're compromising there. Luther, he did some things right, he did some things wrong. And so I don't tie myself to any of these people. What they did is just historical, it's factual, and we're just left there looking at it going, okay, well, if I was in Erasmus's shoes, where would I be traveling and what would I be saying and where would I be going? And because many heads were getting lobbed off at this time. And we see, someone like, even in England, we see Henry VIII, killing 300 people, Catholics. Okay, so here we have the interesting thing about the grammar. It would torture grammarians that the spirit, water, and blood are described by the phrases, there are three, and these are one, especially since the words spirit, water, and blood are grammatically neuter in Greek. Indeed, the apostle pays more regard to the sense than to the words. For the three witnesses, as if they were three people, he substitutes three things, spirit, water, and blood. You use the same construction if you say the building is witness to the kind of builder you are. And so he's pointing out the grammatical issue that we've brought up many times, which is quite interesting. So we've got footnotes here. Okay, so we've looked at those footnotes. And it has, and these three are one. In the 1516, it had, and the words these is redundant. 1519, except as far as the translator added it to make the meaning plain. So he's saying, instead of these three are one, it could have, and three are one. So it's sort of like these is sort of like a, it's a word which, and remember he's doing a Latin translation, so perhaps it wasn't needed so much in the Latin. 1516, it goes back and says, and it should not be one, but unto one. And then 1527 it has ice to n, as in some manuscripts. So there's a little bit of chopping and changing of the 1516, then 1519 he's added a little bit more, 1516 a little bit again, then 1527 a bit more. But he's basically saying that the neuter in Greek, he's saying this tortures grammarians because it's the wrong grammar. And how do you get this, the spirit, the water, and the blood These are neuter. How do you get these without having the comma there? The grammar of these words shouldn't have changed, but it did. So this is one of the main points of Georgios Babiniotis. So let's see if there's any more. That's it. Wow. So that's the last thing that he mentions is the grammatical issues. So, yeah, so that's so we've got Docky in the house saying g'day. So, yeah, that I really wanted to go through that for quite a long time. What I might actually do is when I'm feeling up to it, I'm going to get this whole section and I'm going to just read through it, because what I want to do is put it into an audio type of format. So maybe in my next video, it might be a short one. And maybe I'll put it into an audio reader, actually. And I'll go through and put this whole Appendix 2 here. All the English, I'll just put it into an audio reader and just run through it, and maybe just sort of scroll along as we go. And so if you want to read it as it's going, it'd be great to find an audio reader that can read the Latin well, and perhaps even the Greek. Maybe even Google Translate can do that. I mean, half the time you throw things into there. I'm sure there's some sort of bot out there that can do it.
This text of Erasmus' 2 annotations on the Johannine comma is based on the 5th edition of 1535 and on a collation of this edition with all preceding editions. 15.
Okay, so there's some things that he's written at the beginning, but then he jumps into it. So yeah, I think that's all I have to do. I sort of feel like if I haven't done a 5 or 6 hour video, I haven't done anything. But I've gone for an hour and 46. Usually the videos are 4.5 hours long. Now I know Mark Ward just brought out a video from India, and that's fine. There's nothing wrong with visiting India. I just wonder what he's actually doing there. I can't just see him, going out in the streets with the translator and preaching, and going around, offering to pray for people and helping people and all. Maybe they're doing that, but it just seemed like they're just holding their cameras up, going, "Wow, poor people," which is it's amazing in the West. I'm not just saying this about Mark Ward. I'm just saying this about Western people. It's been said that people in the West will spend all types of money to go and visit poor people just to look at them. It's sort of like a curiosity, like get a bus. We're all in a bus. We've all paid $9,000 to return tickets, and we've got the bus trip in the middle, and we're going to climb this mountain and going to go and visit all the sites, but there's some poor people, and we're just in a bus, air-conditioned bus. It's quite interesting. And when you get down in the dirt with people, it's a whole different world. And going out with it's really encouraging for Christians when you go out street preaching or evangelizing where people wouldn't go. And so when I go to Papua New Guinea, I say, take me to the most dangerous areas where people get murdered. And we go there and preach, and we go banging on the doors, and gangsters are there, and we're saying, you need Jesus, you need to repent. And we do all that sort of stuff, and it's pretty wild. And so Bougainville, we were told, don't go there. So I've been there 7 times, found that they're the most friendliest people. And even a lot of the what you would call rascals would be there street preaching, and the rascals who are there, you're wondering whether they're going to steal your stuff or not. I went back a year later, and here's this guy. His name was Nick as well, and he was dressed in a suit and tie. I'm like, what's happened to you, Nick? And he's like, oh, I listened to your preaching last time, and I prayed, and I become born again. I'm a Christian. I was like, wow, this stuff actually works. And he was totally changed, and he had a job. He was sitting in the gutter, like chewing betel nut, had all red all around his mouth and just spitting, and sitting there with James, the guy who's always there in the wheelchair. And, they're just the most exciting thing that happens in their day is, you know, where they're going to urinate and do a number two and get drunk. That's their day, you know. And so, but I was preaching in their area and got a lot of respect from those guys, and I'd always pray for them, and so yeah, it's great fun doing that. But you know, I really wish that some of the guys, like you know, some of the guys on the contra side of the Bible version debate, you know, sometimes when I'm in New Guinea and I'm doing things, or I'm in Pakistan and going from house to house, just visiting people, and I'm sort of like, man, it would be so good for someone like James White to come along and do this. I know he used to be really active in evangelism, you know, chatting with the Mormons and all that, but you know, like going out and not just to talk to one family and, you know, get hot and go back and have a lunch. Like go out for 3 or 4 hours, like it's a job, and go and talk to 100 people. Go preaching where there's like 600 people standing around listening, and you're preaching, you're praying for people. You just do it until you're absolutely exhausted, and you just look back and go, wow, God used me. And then to see the fruit of that years and years later, people's lives are touched, many other Christians encouraged, and they're like, wow, white guys just don't come into this neighborhood. It's like, look, we're human too. And that's one of the things where, yeah, I'm not just trying to blow my own trumpet here, but I've had, you know, situations like when I was in the Philippines, we're going over to Bacolod City to do some preaching, and I'm sitting there with the pastor, and I'm just chatting with him, and we're on this boat, and he said, you know, when the American pastors come here, they don't even want to touch us. They don't want to touch our skin. They're sitting like this, like they don't want to even talk to us. But he said, when you Australians are here, you put your arm around us and you're very friendly. And I said, it's because we're very multicultural. I said, when we grow up, we're, especially in the cities, it's way different in the outback because it's usually just white and black. But in the cities, it's so multicultural. You've got so many Italians and Greeks and Chinese, and like I had Chinese, Japanese, Greek, French, Pakistani. We had so many different people in just my class, and there's probably only 20 people in the class. And so you're looking at more than half the class are from somewhere else around the world. So you just get used to that. My best friend was from Lebanon. He was black as, and so you just get you don't even think about these things. And so when you're in a situation where you're talking to someone, you're not looking down on them. That's what they feel. They get looked down on, and a lot of Christians do that. And I've seen it, you know. And in a way, when I've been to places where I don't really know the culture, or usually when they can't speak English, that's when I feel like that. The dorky tourist on the bus, like how can I preach to these guys? I haven't got an interpreter. What do? And like when I was in Cambodia, it was a bit like that at the beginning. Then we found our translator, and he came everywhere with us. We went to the hospital, and I just said, we'll just go to the hospital and we'll go preaching. And he said, oh, no, you can't do that here. I said, well, if we can't, they'll kick us out. So I just, okay, let's just go. And he was waiting at the gate like he's going to get kicked out. This is like he was cringing, like, because I was just like, we're just going to go in and we're going to pray for everyone in the hospital, all the doctors and everyone, and we're going to preach to them and tell them it's heaven or hell, and that's it. And so I walked into the emergency room. I'm like, does anyone here speak English? And one person raised their hand. I said, oh, okay. So I went over to them, started talking. I said, look, they think we're doctors because we're sort of dressed up a little bit, and so they want to talk. And then I'm like, okay, it's about Jesus. And they're like, okay, tell us more. And they were just into it. And in the end, we went through the emergency ward. We prayed for everyone there. Then we went to the like there was this area where there was just like 15 beds all in one room, and we ended up like as the interpreter, after a while he came in and he started interpreting, and so we could talk to everyone. We ended up praying for everyone, all the doctors. They were all lining up, pray for me, help, we need help here, we're struggling, we're and so we're praying for them all. Then they had this sort of like Chick Tract style comic. It wasn't Chick, but it was like a basic sort of gospel type thing. And in the end, we're in this one room, and everyone from the hospital had come to this one room. And there, people are sitting in bed, and people are, looking through the doors, and instead of me just preaching, I just said, look, you just preach to the pastor. I said, you just go for it. And by then he's just like right into it and just glowing, and he had this track. And so he was reading through the track, just reading the scriptures, and he went through it all. And I can't understand a word they're saying. It's like, come on. And then sometimes they're all just sitting there glued. Then they're all bursting out laughing, and then they're all glued again. And then he gets to the end, and then he's like, okay, let's all pray. And they're all putting their heads, it's like a church service, And so just stepping out and doing things like that, that's like, I actually miss the whole COVID thing. Has sort of thrown a bit of a spanner in the works. But I really want to get back into doing that type of thing. There are some countries where you still have to be, have this special injection apparently to travel, where I've never had any of those. And so I'm waiting for some doors to open up again. But, unfortunately, there's so much money to be made in these type of things that it can hinder travel. But anyway, this has nothing to do with Erasmus or the comma. But I'm going to bail, and I'll see you guys later.